You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. On a cold gray morning in December of 2002, 26-year-old Lydia Fairchild stepped out of her modest apartment in Richland, Washington. Her thick reddish-brown hair was tied back in a ponytail, and there were dark circles under her blue eyes. Lydia had not slept much the night before because there was a lot on her mind. She and her longtime boyfriend, Jamie Townsend, had just broken up again. Their relationship had been through many ups and downs over the last several years. They loved each other, but lately they just couldn't seem to get along, and so they had finally decided to just end things. It was a tough situation, especially because they shared 2 kids, a 2-year-old boy and a 1-year-old girl. And things had become even more complicated because Lydia had recently found out that she was pregnant again. Lydia walked off the front steps and headed to her car, trying her best to ignore her overflowing mailbox. She didn't need to look at what was in her mailbox to know it was a whole bunch of bills that were all past due. The bills were another reminder of how challenging life had become lately. She was newly single, pregnant, and also unemployed. While Richland, Washington was a comfortable and safe place to call home, trying to find a job there had been a struggle for Lydia, and her savings were now running low. But she did have one thing she was counting on to keep her going. Several weeks ago, she'd applied for welfare benefits, and this morning, she finally got a phone call about her application. Lydia thought everything had been approved, but the person who called her said there was a problem and she would have to come down to the office to talk about it. And so that was where she was going this morning. So Lydia got into her car and she drove to the social services department a few miles away. Meanwhile, the social worker who had called Lydia waited for her in his office. Sitting next to him was his colleague, a woman dressed in a conservative dark blue suit. Neither of them said very much. They were too focused on studying Lydia's case file. The two of them had seen hundreds of welfare applications over the past few years, but never one like Lydia's, and so they were very curious to see what she would have to say. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the door and Lydia entered. Once she sat down, the social worker who had called her got right to the point. There was a problem with the DNA tests that Lydia and her kids had submitted in order to receive these welfare benefits. The results showed that Lydia was not actually the children's mother. For a long moment, Lydia didn't say anything. Then she let out an awkward laugh and told them there had to be some mistake. But the social worker shook his head. DNA testing had a 100% accuracy rate. Lydia just sat back in her chair with this look of total disbelief in her eyes. And it was at this point the social worker's colleague, who was dressed in the dark blue suit, finally spoke up and introduced herself. She told Lydia she was not a social worker, she was a lawyer, and she was with the prosecutor's office. The lawyer got right to the point. Lydia had clearly committed welfare fraud. She had claimed children that were not hers as dependents on her welfare application, and this was a serious crime. And so the lawyer asked Lydia point blank if she was trying to pass these kids off as her own in order to collect a higher welfare payment. And Lydia said no, of course not. Then the lawyer suggested that Lydia must have stolen someone's identity, but Lydia immediately pulled out her driver's license, which had her name on it and all of the information she had included on her application, and Lydia promised the license was real. Lydia insisted that her kids were her natural-born children. She claimed she even had proof since she had their birth certificates and the baby's footprints from the hospital. The lawyer flashed a worried look over at the social worker. Technically, they both knew it was possible that Lydia could have given birth to these kids without actually sharing their DNA, but that could only happen if she was a surrogate mother. And the social worker realized that if that was the case, that could open up a whole other set of very dark possibilities. Lydia could have been paid to be a surrogate, and then when she actually delivered the kids, she could have kidnapped them from their real mother. If that was the case, this situation could go beyond welfare fraud. The real mother could be out there somewhere desperately looking for her kids. Or even worse, perhaps the mother was harmed. The social worker cleared his mind and tried to stay objective. Lydia's horrified reaction to all of their questions made it hard to believe that she was some hardened criminal. But the best scammers could be great actors, and in his career, the social worker had seen plenty of criminals put on Oscar-worthy performances. Finally, after Lydia continued to deny that she had done anything wrong, the social worker and the lawyer told her that she was free to go. But as she gathered her things, the woman from the prosecutor's office gave her a dire warning. Prosecutors were preparing a criminal case against her, and they could take her kids at any moment. Lydia's hands were shaking as she drove home from the interview. She didn't know what to think. All she knew was that she had to get home and figure out what to do next. Lydia rushed through the front door of her apartment and called her mother, Carol. Carol tried her best to calm Lydia down, reminding her that the stress would not be good for her current pregnancy. Lydia promised she would try to relax, and admittedly, it did make her feel better just to talk to her mom. After they hung up, Lydia took a deep, calming breath and then started looking for evidence that could help prove her side of the story. She dug up the children's medical records and birth certificates. She grabbed photos of her with the babies. Then she set it all aside to present to the prosecutor. She was sure it would convince the authorities that she really was the real mother. The next day, about 600 miles away, inside of a prison in Montana, an inmate was lying on his bunk bed. The gray-haired 50-year-old man looked up when he heard the familiar sound of a guard rapping on the bars. The guard told him that someone named Carol was calling him. The inmate's name was Rod Fairchild, and he was Lydia's father. Carol was Lydia's mom and Rod's ex-wife. If she was calling, Rod knew it meant something was wrong. Rod sat up and followed the guard to the prison's call center. The moment he picked up the receiver, he could tell that Carol was very upset. She told him everything that was happening to Lydia, that she was in trouble over a DNA test and was now being accused of committing welfare fraud. Rod told her to stay calm and that he was sure there must have been some mistake, and he was positive it would all get cleared up soon. But after the call ended, Rod dropped the optimism he had shared with Carol. As he headed back to his cell, he couldn't help but think about the DNA evidence. He wanted to believe his daughter, but he knew DNA didn't lie. And if she tried to fight DNA evidence in court, he was afraid she would lose. As her father, Rod felt terrible about the whole situation, and he even felt a little bit guilty. After all, he was serving time for business fraud, and now his daughter was in trouble over welfare fraud, and so he knew he had not set a great example for his child. Either way, Rod wondered if his daughter had gotten herself into trouble and was now trying to cover it up. The following week, the prosecutor, who was now in charge of Lydia's case, was busy building a case against her. He had to be absolutely certain that there had not been an error with Lydia's DNA test. Although it was highly unlikely, Lydia's samples could have been accidentally switched with someone else's, or maybe they had been tainted somehow. So just to be safe, he ordered Lydia and her kids to come in and submit 3 more DNA samples for testing. It took a few months to process the tests, but sometime around March of 2003, the prosecutor had his answer, and it was exactly what he expected. The prosecutor phoned Lydia to tell her the results. According to this second round of testing, Lydia was still not the children's biological mother. Lydia insisted these results were wrong too, and she began to argue with the prosecutor. She asked if the authorities had seen the birth certificates, the baby footprints, and all the photos of her with the kids. The prosecutor told Lydia that yes, they'd seen them, but it didn't matter. Nobody was denying that she gave birth to the kids. They're denying that they are her kids. At this point, the authorities were convinced that Lydia was running some sort of surrogacy scam. With the newest rounds of DNA tests in their hands, they had everything they needed to convict Lydia. The prosecutor informed her she'd be receiving a court summons and advised her to hire a lawyer. Lydia hung up from the prosecutor in a total daze. She knew she was in deep trouble. Lydia didn't have any time to waste. so she pulled out a phone book and started going through the yellow pages looking for family law attorneys. She explained her situation to each one, but they all said the same thing. There was no sense in fighting DNA evidence, and so none of the lawyers she contacted would agree to represent her. They knew they would lose. By the end of April, when Lydia was 8 months pregnant, she was a total nervous wreck and basically wasn't eating. She had to borrow money since she never got her welfare benefits, and she couldn't get a job because of all the legal trouble she was in. Her first hearing was in a few weeks, on May 16, 2003, and somehow she'd have to argue her case in front of a judge without a lawyer. On May 16, 2003, Lydia's case went to court. This was a preliminary hearing to determine what would happen to her kids while her case proceeded. The judge overseeing the hearing sat in his chambers, reviewing the evidence against Lydia. He thought it was the strangest case he'd ever seen. The prosecution wanted to put her son and daughter in foster care, and it was now up to him, the judge, to decide. He put on his robe and walked into the courtroom, curious to meet the mother. Lydia, who was now 9 months pregnant, struggled to stand up when the judge entered the courtroom. When the judge sat down, he took a closer look at Lydia. She looked ready to give birth at any moment. The judge asked Lydia when she was due, and she told him she was scheduled to be induced into labor in just 3 days. The judge thought about this. Taking the kids away from her at this point, even if they were not technically her kids, seemed unnecessarily cruel. And so he told Lydia that he was prepared to let her keep custody of the kids for the moment, but he had conditions. He needed her and the newborn baby to submit a fresh round of DNA samples. A court officer would literally be present for the birth of this third kid, and the second that baby was born, they would take its DNA to be tested. The following Monday, May 19, 2003, Lydia checked into the hospital. She was induced into labor, and sure enough, the court officer who was in the room witnessed her give birth to a baby boy, who Lydia named Jamie II after her former boyfriend and the father of the baby. As nurses huddled around the newborn, the court officer tapped a lab technician on the shoulder. Before Lydia could hold little Jamie for the first time, the tech drew a vial of blood from the baby. He handed the vial to the court officer, who promptly turned and headed for the door. Before the officer left the room, she looked back for a moment. As Lydia now cuddled with her newborn son for the first time, it was hard for the court officer to believe that this woman was anything but a genuine loving mother. The officer looked down at the vial in her hand. It would prove whether Lydia was this baby's biological mother, or if she was really the scheming liar that prosecutors claimed she was. 2 weeks later, the results from Lydia and her new baby's blood tests came back. It showed that, once again, she and her child did not share any DNA, so she could not be the baby's biological mother. Prosecutors were more sure than ever that Lydia was in fact running some kind of surrogacy scam. Now Lydia was in even bigger trouble than before. And without a lawyer, she ran an even bigger risk of losing her case. Just a few days after Lydia's newest DNA results came back showing she was not the biological mother of her newest baby, a 41-year-old attorney named Alan Tyndall sat down at his cluttered desk with his morning coffee. He had a stack of paperwork that he was not looking forward to doing that day, so when his secretary patched through a potential client, he was happy to take the call. It was Lydia, and as Alan listened to her story, he wasn't sure what to make of her. Like any good lawyer, he knew DNA evidence was the gold standard. But Alan enjoyed a challenge. He was a proud military veteran and former public defender. He was used to taking on tough situations. Alan was especially curious about Lydia's most recent DNA test. To his knowledge, the only way a woman could give birth to a baby that was not hers was if she was a surrogate. But Lydia said she wasn't, and this child and the other two were really her biological children. Alan had never heard of someone successfully overturning DNA evidence, but he believed everyone had a right to legal representation, and somehow he believed that Lydia had to be telling the truth. And so he told her he would take her case. With Lydia's next court date looming, Alan got straight to work. He spent long nights at his office looking for any logical way to defend her, but he kept arriving at the same conclusion. There was no fighting DNA evidence. After several weeks, Alan was still no closer to finding a way to defend Lydia, until one morning, his secretary brought him a recent edition of the New England Journal of Medicine. It came with a note from a colleague. There was an article they thought could be relevant to Lydia's case. At first, Alan shrugged it off. Lydia's case was starting to make the local news because it was so unusual, and so as a result, Alan had been getting a lot of unsolicited advice from people who had seen her story on the news. But Alan was not making much progress on his own, so he picked up the thick journal and started to flip through it. And by the time he got to the end, his eyes were wide. He could not believe what he had just read. It was a long shot, but if what he had read was true, it could be the key to winning this impossible case. Alan's first step was to convince the judge to postpone the trial. He explained that Lydia needed to undergo more in-depth testing to try out this new theory he had, and it could take months to get the results. The judge agreed to delay the court date until April of 2004, nearly a year away. Alan was confident that would give them enough time. And so right away, he sent Lydia off to lab after lab where she underwent a battery of tests. Then they waited. Almost a year went by, and Alan was still waiting for the results, and the date for Lydia's hearing was fast approaching. One night, Alan was in his office working on his opening statement for Lydia's case when his phone rang. It was the doctor overseeing Lydia's lab work, and he told Alan he had some bad news. There was still too much data to analyze, and Lydia's test results wouldn't be ready in time for her hearing. Alan could not hide his disappointment. This was a huge setback, but he knew the judge wouldn't delay the trial any longer. And so, in April of 2004, Alan and Lydia walked into the courthouse where her trial would finally take place. Once they were seated, Alan leaned over to reassure her. Then he stood up and faced the judge. Alan didn't have the science-based evidence that he'd been counting on this whole time. What he had instead was a very strange story to tell, and everything in the whole case came down to whether he could get the judge to believe it. He began to explain why a schoolteacher who lived 3,000 miles away in Boston, Massachusetts, and who had never met or even heard of Lydia, could prove his client was innocent. That schoolteacher's name was Karen Keegan, and in the late 1990s, Karen was sick and needed a kidney transplant. Hoping her sons would be a match, they all took a DNA test. And just like Lydia, the results showed there was a 0% chance that Karen was the mother of her kids. But unlike Lydia, Karen was able to find out why. A Harvard doctor looked into her case and suggested an extremely bizarre scenario. Karen was something called a human chimera. This condition was named after a creature from Greek mythology who had a lion's head, a goat's body, and a serpent's tail. So basically, it was several different animals rolled into one. When a woman conceives twins, it's because 2 eggs in her womb have been fertilized. On extremely rare occasions, the 2 eggs then fuse a few days after fertilization, and when that happens, the resulting embryo becomes one fetus with 2 different genetic codes. This is a human chimera. And once it's born, different parts of its body have unique strands of DNA. That explained why Karen Keegan didn't come up as a genetic match for both of her sons. The sample they had tested came from her other set of DNA. But then they tested different parts of Karen's body, her hair, her skin, even her bladder, and eventually they found DNA that did match her sons, and it came from Karen's thyroid gland. Alan argued that Lydia had to be a chimera too. Essentially, he was telling the judge that Lydia was her own twin. And because of this, samples may have been taken from a part of Lydia's body that had a different set of DNA than her kids. Unfortunately, they still had not found any tissue within Lydia that matched her kids' DNA yet. But they did have something. Alan had gotten Lydia's mom tested, and that test proved that at least she, the mother, shared DNA with Lydia's children. That meant either Lydia or Lydia's sister had to be the kid's mother. The judge took a moment to digest the evidence. If all his years on the bench taught him one thing, it was that DNA tests were always right. But Alan's argument was very compelling. Then the judge made his announcement. He told the court he believed Lydia Fairchild was indeed the mother of these kids. In his opinion, the story of Karen Keegan, paired with the new DNA results of Lydia's mother, proved that Lydia had to be a human chimera. And so the judge dismissed Lydia's case and admitted that he was wrong. After almost 2 years, Lydia's ordeal was finally over. She burst into tears as Alan put his arm around her. She had been telling the truth, as crazy as it sounded, the whole time. A few months later, doctors were able to finally show that Lydia's DNA did match her kids. They found the matching DNA from a cervical smear. Lydia Fairchild went down in textbooks as only one of 100 human chimeras ever identified. And while her ordeal would forever haunt her, it did bring her family closer together than they ever had been before. Lydia and her ex-boyfriend, Jamie Townsend, did get back together long enough to have a 4th child. This time around, because the world knew that Lydia was a human chimera, nobody questioned if she was. The SS Andrea Doria, which was a beautiful ocean liner, was considered to be Italy's largest, fastest, and safest ship. But those things would not be what this ship was remembered for. On July 25th of that year, the ship was sailing towards the east coast of the United States when it ran into some very heavy fog. And so, following procedure, the captain slowed the vessel down and turned on their fog whistle. A little while later, another vessel, the Swedish ocean liner called the SS Stockholm, entered the fog as well, but they were unaware of Andrea Doria's position. Now, both vessels were using radar, but unfortunately, both vessels misinterpreted what they were seeing, and so neither of them communicated with the other as they careened towards each other. When visual contact was finally made between the two ships, it was too late. A collision was imminent. At 11:10 p.m. that night, the bow of the Stockholm plowed directly into the side of the Andrea Doria, penetrating over 40 feet inside the ship before coming back out again. The impact killed 46 people on the Andrea Doria and 5 people on the Stockholm. When the story broke, every major news outlet around the world picked it up, including ABC News in the United States. And the news correspondent that they chose to cover this story was a man named Edward Morgan. And unbeknownst to his co-workers, his 14-year-old daughter, Linda Morgan, was on board the Andrea Doria, and just before he went on, he was informed that she was amongst the missing and presumed dead, and there was virtually nothing he could do but wait for more information. And so despite his incredible burden, Edward still went on the air and reported the story without ever losing his composure and without ever mentioning his daughter. But after he got off the air, another story began to develop about the crash. Apparently, a girl who was asleep in one of the rooms on the Andrea Doria that experienced a direct hit from the Stockholm woke up after the crash and didn't know where she was, and she began yelling out for her mother. Meanwhile, a man on board the Stockholm heard the girl's cries, and he ran towards the front of the Stockholm, which is where he heard these cries coming from, and when he got up there, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Perched on the destroyed bow of the Stockholm was a bed, and on that bed was a relatively unhurt 14-year-old girl named Linda Morgan. It would turn out when the Stockholm penetrated into the Andrea Doria, the bow of the Stockholm scooped the bed Linda Morgan was on up and kind of dragged her into the ship, and then when it retracted out of the Andrea Doria, it brought that bed and Linda Morgan with it. When Edward Morgan found out that his daughter was the so-called miracle girl, he was overcome with emotions, and he would go back on the air, and this time he would talk about his daughter and her incredible survival story, and he would also talk about how hard it was to deliver the news when it was about someone he loved. Linda would make a full physical recovery. She only suffered from a broken arm, but she would suffer enormously from survivor's guilt as her stepfather and her half-sister were both killed in the crash. On April 27, 1997, a farmer in Indonesia was walking his livestock through a thick sugarcane field near his house when he tripped on something. After he regained his balance and looked down, he noticed a strange mound of dirt that seemed totally out of place. He wanted to dig it up just out of curiosity, but he wasn't on his property, so instead he walked back to the village and he told the village leader about this strange pile of dirt and suggested he see what's under it. So the village leader and some other men headed back out to the field. They find this dirt pile, and the first thing they do is they poke it with a stick. The stick went right into the pile. It was a soft pile of dirt, and when they pulled it out, this horrible stench filled the air that was coming out of this mound. Worried about what they might find underneath this pile, the men decide to leave it alone and go back to the village and tell authorities about it, and the authorities promptly tell them to go back out there and uncover this thing and tell them what they find. And so the village leader and some more men head back out to the field and they start digging. And pretty quickly, their shovels strike something that's fairly soft inside of this mound. And so after delicately removing some more dirt, they discover a woman's face is looking right back at them. It appeared she'd been buried up to her neck, and then someone had just thrown dirt on top of her head. At this point, the authorities did come out, and they were able to identify the body as belonging to a 21-year-old local woman named Dewi. After asking around the village about this girl, the police determined the last time anyone had seen her was 3 days earlier when she had left her house to run an errand. But after that, no one knew what happened to her. Just a few hours after Dewi's discovery, a 15-year-old rickshaw driver came to the police with additional information. He said 3 days earlier, on the evening of April 24th, so the same day that people had seen Dewi last, he said she had come to him to ask for a ride. And when she got into the rickshaw, he asked where she wanted to go, and she said she did not want to tell him specifically where she was going. Instead, she just wanted him to drive in a particular direction, and she would give him more information about how to get where she wanted to go as they got closer. And so this really intrigued the driver. And so after he began going in this direction, he turned to her again and said, can you tell me anything more about where we're going? This is really weird that you're not giving me any more information. And so finally, Dewi relented, and she told him she was going to see the shaman. A shaman, in simple terms, is someone who uses magic to cure the sick. The driver did think it was odd that this girl was going to see the shaman in the middle of the night and she was being so secretive about it, but after he dropped her off, he hadn't given it much thought until he found out she had died. The police approached the shaman, who was 45-year-old Ahmad Siraji, and they asked him if he had been with Dewi on the night of April 24th. Initially, Siraji said no, he had not been with her, and he had no idea what happened to her. But after police searched his house and found Dewi's belongings inside, Siraji said, okay, I've been lying and I have a confession to make. And he would very nonchalantly tell police that not only had he killed Dewi, he had also killed dozens of other women the same way and buried them in the sugarcane field. And so the police went out to the field and started looking around, and they found all these mounds of dirt all over the place, and under them were women buried up to their neck. After the excavation was all done, the police believed they found the bodies of 42 different women, but truthfully, that was just a guess. They believed there could be more. During his trial, Siraji explained in detail why he did the things he did. He said back in 1986, so 11 years earlier, he had this vivid dream where his deceased father came to him and instructed him to drink the saliva of 70 women. And if he did that, he would become immortal. When Siraji woke up, he didn't chalk up this experience as just a strange dream. He believed he had just had a real interaction with the spirit of his dead father, and so he decided he would do as he was told. But his father didn't explain to him how he was going to extract the saliva from these 70 women. And so after thinking about it for a couple of days, Siraji decided the most efficient way to do it would be to just kill the women and then forcibly take their saliva. To find his victims, Siraji began telling people in his village that he had supernatural powers, that he was able to grant women specifically everlasting beauty and riches. And many people believed it. And so as this rumor spread not only around his village, but to surrounding areas, lots of women heard about it and came to him and requested his services. He would tell them to come back later that night when it was totally dark and to not tell anyone where they were going. Once they arrived, they would come inside of Siraji's house and they would pay him a fee that was roughly equivalent to $300. And then he would tell them he needed to perform a ritual to give them their beauty and their riches. And so they would leave his house, they would cut through a cemetery, and they would enter into that sugarcane field, and they would walk for a while until Siraji stopped them. And he would hand the woman a shovel, and he would tell her to dig a hole in the ground. And he would assure her this is part of the ritual. And so he would stand there as she dug the hole until it was about waist deep. And then he would tell her to get in the hole and put her hands by her side. If she was at all nervous, he would just reassure her again that this is all part of the ritual, that lots of people have done this before, that it's totally safe. And so she'd get in the hole, she'd put her hands by her side, Siraji would take the shovel and he would fill the hole back in until she was completely immobilized, and then at this point, Siraji would pull out a cable, he would wrap it around their neck, and he would strangle them to death. And then once they were dead, he would pull their body out of the hole, and then he would forcibly extract their saliva. And then after that, he would take the shovel again and dig the hole a little bit deeper, and then he would put the body back inside the hole, making sure their head was still sticking out of the ground. And he would orient them so their face was looking towards his house, because he believed having these women constantly looking at him at all hours of the day gave him more power. He said as for Dewi, when she first came to his house and she had paid that fee, she was worried about leaving and going and doing this ritual. It scared her. And so Siraji told her to wait, and he went into the other room where his wife was, and he told her that, hey, I'm gonna go kill this girl and I need your help. I need you to calm her down. And his wife, who had no idea her husband was a mass murderer, just immediately went along with it. She came back into the room and she assured Dewi that everything was totally fine. They had done this before. It was all going to be perfectly safe. And she even said she would come with them to do this ritual. And so at this, Dewi was much more calm and she agreed to go. And so the trio left the house. They went through the cemetery out to the field, and then only 2 people came back. Siraji was executed in 2008 by firing squad, and his wife was sentenced to life in prison. Around midnight on September 3rd, 1986, Doug Wells and his wife Kristen were pulling onto their street in western Montana when they noticed a camper parked in front of their house. Neither of them recognized the camper, and so when they pulled into their driveway, Doug got out and walked over and looked inside to see if anyone was in there. And there was a man sleeping in the front seat. Doug didn't wake him up. Instead, he went back to his wife. They talked about it, and they decided that this man must have just randomly parked in front of their house, and that most likely the next day he would leave. And so the couple went inside their house and they began getting ready for bed. At some point, Doug rounded up all the trash inside of the house and was going to bring it outside to put into the trash bin. And when he went outside, standing in his front lawn is the same guy who was just sleeping inside of the camper. And so Doug very cautiously goes down the front steps and he yells out to this guy and says, what are you doing here? And immediately the man put his hands up and said he meant no harm. He said his name was Wayne Nance, and he actually worked with Doug's wife, Kristen, at the furniture store in town. Wayne went on to say that he happened to be driving down their street earlier that day, and he spotted someone standing outside one of their windows looking in their house, and he knew it was Kristen's house, and he looked in their driveway and he saw that Kristen wasn't home and it looked like nobody was home. And so he decided he would just park out front and try to scare off this person and wait for Kristen to get back. But by the time Kristen got back, he had fallen asleep. Doug was totally caught off guard by this whole situation. The idea that there's this guy on his property talking about another guy that was lurking around his property. And so he asked Wayne, did you see this guy again after that first time you saw him? And Wayne said no, he hadn't, but he didn't have a flashlight. And so maybe if Doug went in the house and got some flashlights, the 2 of them could walk the property and make sure nobody was there. Doug thanked him for the offer and said, okay, well, why don't you come in the house and I'll go look for those flashlights. And so Doug led the way inside of his house, and as soon as Wayne got in the house and shut the front door behind him, he pulled out a metal pipe he was hiding and smashed Doug over the back of the head. Doug turned around and Wayne hit him again over the face, and before long the 2 of them were struggling on the ground. Kristen, who was upstairs, heard the commotion, and she came running down the stairs, and she sees at the bottom her husband, who's bleeding profusely from his head. He's covering himself up on the ground, while Wayne, her co-worker, is standing over him, punching and kicking him. Before Kristen could do anything, Wayne noticed her up on the stairs, and he drew a pistol and aimed it at her and told her to come down here and tie up your husband's arms and legs. Kristen, who's in shock, is just hoping this was just a robbery and that they would have their lives spared. And so she does as she's told. She walks down, Wayne throws her some cord, she ties up her husband's arms and legs, and then afterwards, Wayne leads Kristen back upstairs to the bedroom where he ties her up as well. After that, Wayne went back down to the main floor where Doug was still laying on the ground, and he grabbed Doug by the legs and he pulled him down the flight of stairs to the basement where he tied him up to a pole. And then he savagely beat him with the pipe before Wayne pulled out an 8-inch blade and plunged it directly into Doug's chest all the way in. And then when he pulled it out again, Doug slumped over. Wayne went back upstairs upstairs all the way to the second floor to check on Kristen, and he saw she had managed to get partially out of her restraints and she was reaching for the landline, and so he jumped on top of her and managed to restrain her all over again. And then after he was confident in her restraints, he went back downstairs to make sure Doug was dead. When he got down there, he saw Doug was still slouched over in the same position he had left him, and so Wayne assumed Doug must be dead, and Wayne went back upstairs to assault Kristen. But Wayne was wrong. Doug wasn't dead. And after Wayne went upstairs that second time, Doug, despite his horrific head and chest injuries, managed to wriggle out of his restraints and then hobbled over to a workbench where he had a rifle laying out because Doug was actually a gunsmith. And so he took the rifle and he loaded it with the one round he found on the table. And then he walked over to the base of the stairs, he raised his rifle, and he made his way up to the main floor. He didn't come in contact with Wayne, and he looked around the first floor, he didn't see him, and he heard his wife screaming upstairs. And so he made his way to the next set of stairs and began walking up with his rifle raised. At the top of the stairs to the second floor, there was a hallway that ran right and left out of sight. And so as Doug is making his way up, he can hear off to the left, out of view, his wife screaming in the bedroom, and he can hear the sound of very heavy footsteps running down the hall towards the landing where he is. And so Doug positioned himself in the stairwell, he took aim about chest height with his rifle, and he waited for their attacker to show himself. And so as soon as Wayne came flying around the corner with his knife in his hand, Doug just fired one shot that struck him right in the stomach. Wayne fell backwards, totally shocked at what had just happened. He began to stagger, and Doug, meanwhile, turned his rifle around like a baseball bat because he didn't have any more rounds, and he just starts walking down the hall, smashing Wayne as Wayne continues to stumble and fall and try to run away from Doug. And finally, he gets away from Doug, charges into the bedroom where Kristen is, and he grabs his pistol, and he turns around and he fires 3 shots towards the door where Doug is now standing. And Doug, he's unfazed. One round hits him in the leg, the other 2 miss. He doesn't care. He just walks up to Wayne and begins bashing his head in with the back of this rifle. He hits him so many times that the buttstock of the rifle explodes and the metal of the rifle bends like an L. And at some point, Wayne drops the gun because he's getting viciously beaten on by Doug and his rifle. And Doug sees that, he grabs the pistol and he fires the remaining rounds into Wayne's head. Police and paramedics would show up shortly thereafter, and Doug, Kristen, and their attacker Wayne were all rushed to the hospital. Doug and Kristen would make full recoveries. As for Wayne, he would die the following day from his injuries. After the incident, the police investigated Wayne Nance to see who this guy was, and they discovered that almost certainly he had been a serial killer that was connected to at least 6 cold case murders from 1974 to 1986. But because Wayne never confessed to any of these murders before he died, the true number of people he killed is still unknown. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. If you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, please secretly use the like button's toothbrush to clean a dog's teeth and then just put the brush back. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.